welcome in Mark JOYELLA. Mark has a storied history in our industry and is in the corporate world now, employing his communication skills to be successful with his role at IBM. And Mark is also an advocate for mental health in our industry. As you all know, we've talked about it. We shared last week, which, you guys opening up to me and in our last session really prompted me to be mindful of Mark and his work in terms of educating journalists, experienced and new, to our industry, and advocate that they be aware of this and take care of themselves, and not try to be superhuman when it comes to the very, very stressful work that we do. And so I was so glad that Mark was able to join us and share his experience and his journey in the industry in reference to his work, but also in his advocacy for mental health. So Mark, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure. So you want me just to tell you a little bit about me, and then we can have maybe an open discussion. Anybody can ask whatever they want.
Sounds wonderful.
So Gene and I go way, way back. Like, I was looking at some old pictures back to when I had like gigantic hair, really big hair, and a big voice. But that's all part of being a TV reporter. You kind of adopt your style. You create this, not exactly a character of who you are, but the way you want to deliver stories, whether you're, a very dry, serious person or a very animated, emotional person. And I did very well. Gene and I worked together in Birmingham, and I went on to Tampa, and from Tampa to Miami, and from Miami to New York City. And then I went back to Miami and went to Orlando. And, through that time, the vast majority of that time, I was really just focused on only one thing, which was always the job, and often the next job. I have a job, but how am I going to get the next job? And a lot of times that just becomes a real big focus of, there's so few stations, really, if you think about it. If you're a lawyer, how many law firms are in any city? How many TV stations? Only a few. And how many reporters do they have? A handful. So it's not a world that's easy, as you guys probably have already begun to appreciate. But at the same time, there's nothing like it. Gene and I had a great time telling stories together, and winning Emmys together, and enduring all the things that you have to endure. You get the really fun things every once in a while, but you also have the hours that go on forever, the weekends that don't happen, the holidays that don't happen. You go out sometimes and see things that you probably wish you hadn't seen. And that can sort of take a toll on you over time. But for me, it was always about being fine, So if you had ever asked me in Birmingham, how are you doing? I'm great. You want to go follow this hurricane? Yeah, definitely. You don't mind it's going to be like 18-hour days? Sure. Yeah, no, great. No problem. Outside of work, at that time, I had, nothing. There was no outside of work for me, which made me a great person for a television station, because I had no, family at home to feel drawn to or distracted by or, worry about. It was just me. So, but I think the older I got, the more that was kind of, why is that? Why is that? Why is my job my only thing? And then outside of my job, it's like, there's nothing there. And, but it took me a long time to sort of come to terms with the fact that that was like a problem, that there were a lot of things that weren't exactly right about my life. But so, I got into therapy, and we figured out, I had a few illnesses that could be treated, and that was great. And then when I got treated, I felt better. And then I did end up getting married, had a family, all those things. But what I did not want to do was tell anybody about that. I did not want, I was really afraid that if I shared that in my mind, maybe my news director would worry about me, or they would think, I was always the guy who wanted to be the lead, the lead story at 6. Well, if somebody has an anxiety disorder, are they going to think, I don't know, I don't want him to be working from the morning show through the noon, 4, 5, 6, and then maybe even stay for late. I mean, I don't want to push him too hard. This was the voice in my head. So I kept it a secret. But a few years ago, I was working in Orlando, and I anchored a weekend morning show by myself. There were 2 anchors, me and the weather person. And we did 5 hours nonstop. And it was just this brutal, just this slog where, they built in this block where they would run a package from the night before plus something else. And the news director told me at the time, is like, that's when you go to the bathroom. And I'm like, okay. But during the course of that 5-hour, show, I would repeat the same intros to the same packages over and over and over again. And that was fine. But one day we did this story, and it was about this guy named David Davis, and he was missing. Okay, so it's a missing man. Fine. But the more I kept introducing this story, the more, and watching the story, I kept thinking, man, this story is terrible. This is a really bad story. Because we took this missing man, and he had made some YouTube videos talking about God. And he sounded like a person talking about God. He talked about God as if he was friends with God and talked to him. And in the story, it was presented not as there's a guy who could be in danger, but rather, be careful, there's a guy who's, deranged, and he's on the loose. And at one point in our story, the reporter said, this is not far from the scene of a shooting. Police do not believe they're connected. I'm like, then why did we mention that? What was the point of mentioning that? Except to sort of tarnish this guy and make him into possibly, it was so blatant. It was like, this happened very close to the scene of this other shooting, but they're not related. Okay, then I don't get why that's in the story. So I started writing my news director an email saying, I think we really need to think about how we handle some of these stories about mental illness, because we're sort of playing into some real stereotypes here. And especially the fact that somebody who is, ill, by definition, you're suggesting they're dangerous, the way you're handling the story. Not to mention the fact that we had interviewed, or not, our station had interviewed his landlord. The landlord who had gone through his things, found some doctor's, notes or something, and reported a diagnosis to the people. Said, yeah, he's mentally ill. It's like, okay, I'm pretty sure that is not the way we want to, that's very, not comfortable with that. And then there was a quote that, soundbite. It was like, it's a schizophrenic with a gun. That's not going to end well. I'm like, well, the facts are that if you want to say a schizophrenic with a gun, which if we're going to assume that that's the correct diagnosis, which nobody to this day knows, the person who's in most danger is that guy, not anybody else. People with mental illness are far, far, far more likely to be the victims of violence than to carry it out. So I started writing this email, and just as I'm about to send, I'm on the anchor desk, I'm writing it during commercials and stuff. I'm like, wait a minute, he's going to ask me why I'm so fired up about this. Why is this so important to you? And I don't want to answer that question. So I didn't send it, and whatever, let it go. And then it starts eating at me like, why didn't I send the email? What is my issue with why am I so afraid to do that? So anyway, what happened was I decided to write, a story about me, sort of saying, here's me, here's my story. I've never wanted to tell anybody this, but I don't care anymore. I think it's important because, if I don't talk about it, who's going to talk about it? So, and here's what happened to me. And one of the things I want you guys to think about. I thought I was going to get a whole lot of garbage from either people who watch the news, who might use it against me, or, whatever. I don't know, just a lot of fear. The reality was I got all these emails from people I had worked with and all these stations over the years, and people I knew from, being out in the field, people who worked at other stations who I kept in touch with. And like several of them were like, yeah, I'm both bipolar, but I'm afraid to tell anybody. And I'm like, oh my God, all those years I could have, had these connections and been able to not just have support, but support them. And I was, I realized what a lost opportunity it is. It's like when people are afraid to share that, whether it's you have mental illness or you are feeling unwell for a period of time because you covered a story where you saw something or heard something that really it made you, it shook you or made you feel something and you weren't well. When people are afraid to talk about that, they're also cut off from, getting help. They're also cut off from knowing that other people feel the same way. And it just perpetuates this cycle of stereotype and all that. I ended up a few years ago going back to school and got a master's in writing, journalistic narrative, long form writing. And I wrote about that guy, the missing man. And in the process of writing, I sort of realized, they say that God changes your life, right? And I'm like, this guy who said he was God did in fact change my life. I never met the man, but he did change the course of my life, because I ended up leaving TV news after that. And not because of that, but just as happened to be family decision to come home. So, so I encourage you to think about that, not just in how you tell stories, but in how you take care of each other and yourself. And one more thing I'll mention, and then I'll take a break because I don't know why right now I'm like my mouth is gone dry. I'm trying to remember when this was. I guess almost 2 years ago. I started getting messages from my friends back in Miami. Did you hear about Todd? Have you heard about Todd? And that's just one of those things, you never want to get a message like that. So I'm like, no, what? And so there's this guy I knew in Miami at my station. And to describe him, I would tell you, he is the one guy who's always in a good mood, right? He's the larger than life guy. He did weather, then he became a feature reporter, then he was a weekend anchor. And he's the guy, married, kids, drove the big pickup truck, just always had the best stories. And he had taken his own life. And it's one of those things that just throws you. And, I think of the fact that I spent 8 years working in Miami, never knowing his story. That's something that doesn't just, it can just happen quickly, but, may have happened over a long period of time. But I felt terrible. I was like, I didn't share me, so I was no resource to anybody else. I was of no help. And it made me really think about the fact that we have to take care of each other, and that is as simple as asking somebody, are you okay? That whatever, something like, you covered that thing and what happened, are you all right with that? Because that could really be rough. And sort of think about the fact that is there, I sometimes joke about the fact that in newsrooms, the guys would sometimes talk about having had colonoscopies as a sort of a joking thing they had to go through at a certain age. And I was like, we can talk about that, but nobody wants to talk about taking an antidepressant. It's like, what is that about? So, I would urge you to just be open to the fact that, if you're in the position I was in, which was, you're very afraid, realize that you can maybe help somebody else. And hopefully if you're, don't have any mental illness or anxiety or stress or anything, then great. Then find out, or at least be aware that somebody may. And they may be the person you least expect, because they may be the person using all their energy to appear as happy and as fine as they can be. When I was the sickest I ever was, I would never miss slot. I would do great stories. I won Emmys. I did all that stuff. When I left the building, I would go to a department store and spend hundreds of dollars on shirts to make me feel better. I would go home to my little empty house. I would drink too much. I mean, it was like, but the next day, fine, I would wear my new shirt and I'd be like, hey, perfect. So, so that's kind of my story. And Gene, what else should I talk about? Or you guys can ask me any questions you like.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Anybody have any questions right now?
I really don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you for sharing your story. Because I suffer from mental illness. I suffer from anxiety and depression, and I was really nervous to talk about that because as a journalist, I think I said in the last session, it's kind of like overwhelming sometimes, and like you try to find things. Like my thing is like the one thing I'm worried about going into this industry. I know it can be overwhelming sometimes, but finding something that would get me out of that headspace, because my family is important to me as well, and just trying to find some time for them as well. And I was really nervous about getting into this industry, but I'm passionate about it at the same time. So thank you for sharing your story, because suffering from anxiety is like it's not just having a panic attack, it's a whole different ball game with anxiety. So it's
I know.
But thank you for that.
It's interesting. I don't know the research behind this. I always meant to look it up to see if there is anything to it. It's something I think, like in my mind, it makes sense to me that I think that probably if you studied people in news, you'd find probably a slightly higher percentage of people with some sort of anxiety disorder, perhaps. And one reason I think that is not just because I've met a lot of people since I revealed my story and heard from others, is one of my strengths in news was the fact that when everything goes bad, I am fine. I'm like, you can't rattle me. It's like, your package is dead. Now you're on this. Here's two facts. Here's one picture. You're alive in 2 minutes on the set, and I'm like, okay, great. Okay, got it. And, the reason is because, if you have like PTSD, like I do, you're used to that. That's how it always feels. It's like if I'm at home on a weekend, somebody knocks on the door that I'm not expecting, I flip out. But you do that to me in the newsroom and I'm like, okay, cool. All right. Everything's going crazy. Nothing's working out. Everything that I've worked on has crashed. And now this, what do we do? Okay, fine. All right, good. And, it's like a superpower because, when it's all, there's intense, like deadline pressure. It's like, yeah, that's kind of what it's like to be in my head sometimes. So I'm like, all right, great. So use that to your advantage,
That's kind of how I am. Like when somebody calls me randomly, I think something is wrong, and I'm like a fight or flight mode. I'm like, okay, what's gonna happen? What do I need to do? What's my game plan? So I totally get that. So
yeah, it's hard. And then if you talk to people who were photographers who worked with me, you know, they would say, you know, go up to that senator and ask him why, you know, this, no problem. Go to that door, knock on the door, see if they want to talk about their kid. Okay, I don't love it, but okay. Go downtown and get 5 people on the sidewalk and ask them what they think of gun control. I'm like, crap. I will stand there and be absolutely dreading the idea of doing man on the street interviews. I don't know why, but it's just like, that was like my kryptonite. The absolute most simple thing, I would like go completely in my head about which person, that person? No. And photographers would be like, dude, just anybody. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised that, you know, that didn't become more of an issue, but usually people would be like, I don't know them. Hey, okay, never mind. I don't know why. That was like the one thing I just struggled with, but all the rest of it was fine. Yeah.
Anybody else? Hannah?
Yeah, so I believe you said you left the TV industry because like of family things. Would you say that it is difficult in this industry when moving up to balance family and work?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think obviously lots of people do it and do it, you know, perfectly well. Most of my career, I didn't, because at most of my time, I didn't have a family other than, you know, my, you know, parents and stuff. And that was mostly because, you know, part of my thing was like, I just couldn't hold on to relationships, and I was always just crashing them and, you know, destroying them in very ridiculous ways. But so I can only speak from the last few years in TV. When I was married and had our first daughter, you know, it was okay. You know, I was a weekend morning anchor, so I would go to sleep at, you know, Friday nights and, you know, that type of thing. But, you know, I think we could have done it. The only reason we left was at that time, my mom was very sick, and she lived in Maine and I was in Orlando. And it just was like, I just kept thinking, like, if something happens, I don't want to be here, even though it's super close by plane. It just felt very far away. And my wife was feeling the same. So we just decided to come home, and that's what we did. But yeah, people do it, you know, but the thing you don't want to do is burn yourself out because you want to, you know, well, you don't get into this business if you don't want to like crush it. You know, there are so many easier ways to make a living. So you have that drive, and that's the dynamic, right? Wow, we really want that out of town trip. My spouse is not going to dig that idea, you know, but that's, what are we going to do? You know, so you have to have, I mean, I think you have to have a good relationship, and then you have to figure out how to make it work for you. But yeah, but it wasn't exactly connected. It just timed out that it sort of looked like I just burned the place down as I walked out the door, but it did give me a little bit of freedom to be able to talk about it, write about it, and then not have to go into the newsroom the next day, you know?
Anybody else? I have one.
Uh-oh.
No, it's okay.
This is like doing interviews with Gene as a photographer. Like three questions in, I've got a question. I'm like, okay. And it would usually be a better question than I'd asked.
No, I'm curious now that you are out of the business and have perspective, perhaps that first of all, I guess I don't want to assume that. Have you gained any kind of clarity or perspective from the distance that you now have, that you're not actually in the day-to-day grind in the business? Anything you've learned, a couple things about that walk, and you know, everyone you're speaking to on this call who's an intern is about to begin that walk, so that could be, I think, incredibly valuable for them.
Well, you're talking about stress and anxiety. You're just talking about news in general, because
I think they'd find value in both of those
Yeah.
things.
I mean, I think the first thing is just, take care of yourself. Be aware of when you feel like you're not quite yourself, and pay attention to that. A lot of times you'll feel it in your body, like, locked, muscles, that you can't quite release, that kind of thing. Take care of yourself. When I was in Birmingham, I was invited to a luncheon with the news director. I don't know where this was, but we were out at a luncheon, and he's looking at me and he's like, "Why aren't you eating the lunch?" Which at that stage, free food was not something to be ignored. I was like, should have been like scarfing it up. And I'm like, "Oh, my stomach's upset. I don't really eat." He's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, I have a sort of stomach problem. I don't know, no big deal." And he just starts grilling me, like investigating me, He's like, "Well, what do you mean?" And I'm like, I don't remember how he got me to admit this, but he was like, are you bleeding? And I'm like, kind of, And he's like, "Don't you think you should see a doctor?" I'm like, "Maybe," but that hadn't actually crossed my mind. He's like, "You have to go, like, today." It's so I had just managed to, like, sort of play that off as like everything's fine. Classic sort of example of something that it tends to happen to people with like high anxiety is there are a lot of autoimmune sort of things that can happen with the body where it's sort of like everything gets fired up. So that was just like an example of like how clueless I could be by not paying attention. But about news in general, I mean, you guys are in such an amazing period where you have so much more control over your ability to create content than I did. The only content I could create as a reporter was the stories I created as a reporter for the TV station. Now you can do, I mean, you can do that. You can share things socially. You can, create video in ways that I couldn't have done when I was your age. But and create, a name for yourself that you will hold on to independent of any place you work, and it'll just keep building as you go. So while I encourage you to go for the traditional job, those are great. Those are teaching opportunities. That's where you get your reputation. Do always be thinking about what you can put out there. If you look at social media and things that get shared, a lot of times it's reporters with cell phone video of something that is valuable, and that kind of stuff can dramatically accelerate your career. So I mean, that is the biggest change. So don't take it lightly, because you have control over it. You can do it right now, whether you have gotten that first job or not. You can be doing it just, as long as you just say in your head, "I'm already what I want to be, so I should, act like it." You can do that kind of thing. And so do it.
It's good stuff. So along those lines, Mark, I always say to any classroom that I speak to on campus, and of course to the students in this internship and the other ones that we've been teaching virtually over the last year because of COVID, a couple things. Number one is, don't say no to yourself. Make someone else say no to you. And that part of what I'm trying to get across to these folks is that you may think, "I'm not ready for that opportunity," or "I'm not good enough for that opportunity."
Yeah.
But the reality of it is, if you've repped it and you've done your coursework and you've gotten a few, things under your belt, then there's a good match for you out there somewhere in terms of starting your career and beginning to get those reps in. And so if you look back on that young person at Emory before they went to WSAV, in terms of starting that part of your career and leveling up in your craft, what would you say to these folks as they're about to launch themselves in terms of that confidence and capability when it comes to working their craft?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, first thing, what you said is 100% true. And this was a lesson it took me a while to learn. And that is, whenever possible, say yes, because you will regret it later if you say no. And so I'll give you like the sort of the one that I never have been able to forget. So my first job was actually in Colorado, KJCT Grand Junction, where my first job was not a job. I got somebody to agree to just let me hang out and try to learn. So I waited tables at a restaurant at lunch, and then they would call sometimes and say, "Can you be first out of lunch so you can do a 6 o'clock live shot?" I'm like, "Okay, great." And so I went from intern to morning anchor in 6 months because it was like that kind of tiny market. And then I went on to Savannah and got there just in time. And I hate the fact that this ages me so badly, but there was a Gulf War that was just about to start. So, and that's a big army town. So two-part life lesson. One, always have a passport. Okay, make sure you have your passport. You don't want to not have a passport. So what happened was the army base was getting ready to send 18,000 soldiers to Saudi Arabia. The big military reporter for the station didn't have a valid passport. News director's like, "What the?" So he goes to one of the anchors, no passport. Comes to me, the guy who just arrived from Grand Junction. "Mark, do you have a passport?" I'm like, "Yes." He goes, "Okay, you're going to go to Saudi Arabia." I'm like, "Okay." I've been in TV, in my opinion, a matter of weeks, it felt like at that time. So I'm like, "Okay." So I did. One day, I'm at home. I get a phone call. We had phones then. Pick up the phone. I'm still asleep. The guy's like, "Hey, it's Sergeant somebody from Fort Stewart." Okay. He's like, "Do you know what size uniform you wear?" I'm like, "I don't know." He's like, "No idea." I'm like, "I can tell you how tall I am, what I weigh." He's like, "Okay." And he's like, "So you don't know what size helmet you wear?" I'm like, "No, I don't know. Sorry." He's like, "Okay," hangs up. And I'm like, I should have asked, why is he asking me that? What does that mean? Get to work. They're like, "You're going today." I'm like, "Okay." So we go to Saudi Arabia. While I'm there, as I'm reporting, and I'm because the station group that I worked for had I think 6 small to medium-sized stations. Like Sioux Falls, that type. They all sent their mic flags so that I could carry them in my pants. And every time I would do a stand-up, I would do 5 stand-ups. And since I was still pretty young, that meant I would do 50 stand-ups. But so I'm out in the desert somewhere, these guys with tanks, they're laughing at me because I'm stumbling on my stand-ups and doing over and over. Then I change mic flags and I go through the whole thing again. And at the end, this guy's like, "You want to drive the tank?" And in my mind, I'm like, what would happen if I messed that up? What if I wreck it? I don't know what I was worried about. But I got in my head about it, and I was like, I don't know. And the moment passed, and I to this day, I regret that I didn't drive the tank. So after that, somebody's like, "Do you want to learn how to eat fire?" Yes. "Do you want to fly in the fighter jet?" Yes. "Do you want to do that?" Yes. I try to always say yes, for those opportunities. So, and some of those may be, "Do you want to, take this job?" If you can say yes.
Good stuff. We've talked a little bit about coming to a point in our careers and lives where we find that permission or strength or courage or whatever it is in our inside ourselves to speak up. And sometimes it's in relation to self-care and mental health. Sometimes, in our business, it's speaking up because of a story you see and you don't think it's right and it needs to be made right. And the reality is that, despite the fact that, if you go into your first job, that somebody might have been in the business longer than you, they don't know everything. They're not the smartest people in the world. I had an incident recently where we were having a discussion in the newsroom about a story, and a very young reporter spoke up, and I found myself smiling. And she said, "This is serious. Why are you smiling?" I said, "I'm not smiling because of the story. I'm smiling because you're speaking up and you're fighting." I love that. So can you talk a little bit about coming into your own in relation to being able to dialogue with these people that you see, that you think, well, they know it all, they've been around the block, but they don't, and we need those fresh voices and perspectives in our industry and newsrooms.
Yep, especially and one area where I think this is really important, depending on where your path in journalism takes you. Mine took me from the West to the Deep South, and I had, my experience at Birmingham was that Birmingham was this kind of, reminded me of a kind of like Atlanta. It was kind of a modern city with like great, hospitals, teaching hospitals, and like lots of like athletes would come there to get surgery. They specialized in that sort of thing. But, you drive like 15 minutes outside of downtown, and, it's a whole different world out there. And I remember one time, I don't know if Gene, if you were with me on this time, but we were going to try to talk to somebody, and I was like walking up this guy's driveway, and door opens, he like comes out, and I got the distinct like back off kind of vibe from him. And he's like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, channel 13. He's like, "No, where are you from?" And I was like, "Ooh, Connecticut is not the right answer here." So, I had just arrived from Savannah. So I was like, "Oh, Savannah." He's like, "Oh, Savannah's a nice town." And that became sort of my story while I was in Birmingham. I just figured it was better to be from Savannah than to be from Connecticut. But the reason I was thinking about that is, as far as speaking up and, using your life experience as an expertise, you'll find that not all newsrooms look like America, right? Not all newsroom management looks like the city that it's in. Just because that's the way it is doesn't mean that's the way it should be. And so, if you have a background that gives you, I think for many years, there's been this sort of thing, if you arrive in a newsroom, you are, whether you're Black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, you kind of want to almost like blur it, soften it, and fit in. That was always the sort of the instructions, or at least unspoken, just fit in and everything, and that'd be great. But I think today, your background is something that sets you apart and gives you a certain degree of authority. And so if you hear language in a newscast that a person with your background would find deeply offensive, I encourage you to say so. And that includes hearing things from the boss. I interviewed a guy from Politico who started he wanted to be a TV reporter, and he was in Colorado Springs. So he worked with their voice coach, all their stuff to get the voice and style that they wanted there. Did it, was really excited. News director's like, he said this to him out loud, which is shocking. He's like, you sound too Black for Colorado Springs. And that devastated him. That was like, to him, it was like, you're not good enough. You don't sound the way we want you to sound. Now, that's one of those examples where, okay, institutional racism, this is what it is. That's how it works. But he didn't the best part is he got mad. He's like, screw this guy. I mean, obviously he was working there, but he's fine. He's at Politico now, and he's doing great. But it makes me think about how many people in positions of power tell aspiring reporters, producers, anchors, that kind of stuff. So just remember that when you're in Colorado Springs, the news director feels like a very powerful person. they're still a news director in Colorado Springs, and that's just what they are. And you can have a wonderful career after. If it feels wrong, don't take that in, you know. So, you know, use your everything that makes you who you are. That is something that you cannot acquire. You will have expertise and authority, and you will speak for people who in many newsrooms no one will speak for. So, raise your voice and be heard.
Thank you. Any questions or thoughts from anybody in the internship cohort at this point? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about craft, Mark, because you're somebody that I learned a great deal from in terms of writing. And you're also an incredibly funny person. I can remember so many stories about us sharing times and having fun together on the job. It's one of the things that made Birmingham and at 13 during that period so much fun for me was our work together. But I sound like a broken record when I speak to young people because I preach about reading and writing, you know, outside of work and continually to hone your craft. And so let's talk a little bit about those skills, because you've walked a path where you've employed those skills in journalism, and now you're utilizing those skills in a totally different field. So how should these young people, and it ties in a little bit to what you were saying before about this media has changed and there's a bunch of different things they can do now. So how have your skills as a journalist and a writer been able to, you know, pave the way for you in the corporate world?
Well, everybody, there's no shortage of places where you can make money if you know how to tell a good story, you know. And TV news is just such a good way of learning how to tell stories. You have such a small amount of time. If you want to make it memorable, you've really got to think about, you know, you've got a very few words that you can use. It's almost like writing poetry, right? I've got 90 seconds. I've got to say this, I've got to get this much stuff in. I want to write to the video. So I'm really limited. So it forces you to really think about what's important and what isn't important. And, you know, the non-important stuff, get rid of it. The important stuff, okay, keep that. And then how do I make the important stuff how do I make it so that people will hear it and get it the one time that they're going to really listen to it? The best piece of the best compliment I ever got was from an operations manager in Tampa who he's like, you know why I like your stories? I'm like, no, why? He's like, because I always know what they're about. And I was like, okay, yeah, I get that. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience of watching a story and you're like halfway through the story, like, wait, I'm sorry, what is this about again? I thought the intro suggested that this was going to be about somebody, and now what? I'm lost. The minute somebody is like watching your story and they get to that point where they go like, huh, what? Wait, what? You're done. You've lost them. That ability to grab people at the top, hold on to them, and then, you know, wrap it up, that is like something you can use in a million different ways. And, you know, the other thing is speed, which is, you know, you go to a corporate environment, when I got to IBM, they're like, can you write a story about this? I'm like, sure. They're like, how long would that take? I'm like, I don't know, an hour and a half? They're like, no, how many days would that take? I'm like, I don't even know what you mean. Why would it take days? They're like, well, you need to set up a call to talk to somebody about setting up another call. I'm like, oh, okay, I get you. You know, so they're like, you know, they're always like, well, you're really fast. I'm like, that's right. That's what we get trained to do in TV, is be super fast. And yeah, so those are skills that you can be working on right now before your job. You know, be writing stories, be watching stories. Think, how would I have done that better? If you like something, somebody's style, something, mimic it, copy it, see if you can figure out how they did it, and then make your own.
Good stuff. And then along those lines, we also try to make these folks aware, because many college programs tend to funnel students into the journalism program, and sometimes that's code for print, you know, and then the broadcasting program, and that's people that want to do video. packages, but in reality, everybody on my staff is an MMJ, and even the anchors, they all write text-based AP style web articles, social posts, and they write for script. So, and they shoot their own stuff. Our anchors shoot and edit their own stuff. So there is no one rail like that anymore. You have to be able to do it all.
Right. Yeah. Everything is everything. You be thinking about all of it, and don't be too specialized. Be able to do it all. For sure.
You've worked in a bunch of different markets, all the way to the #1 market. And a lot of young people, when they first come into the business, they're obsessed with market size. Can you talk a little bit about that and the idea of doing quality work wherever you are, and also maybe not defining success by the DMA size that you're in?
Right. No, it has nothing. No, it may have something to do with what you're paid, but it has nothing to do with whether there's good quality TV. Like probably one of the worst stations I ever worked was a network owned and operated station in New York City. It was just like if you ever watch local news in New York, you'll see a lot of just some of the worst video you've ever seen in your life. And that's just the way that the system evolved there. Photographers are a certain breed. They're very separated from the reporter. They don't even edit their own stuff. So they have editors who do it. So it's like but nobody takes ownership of the whole thing. And it was just very, very not what I had always dreamed. And, but you're always your own sort of little independent contractor in a way. You're making your own stories. It's amazing how much freedom reporters get to tell their own stories. There's lots of guardrails and things, but really, you kind of get sent out in the morning and told to go create something, and that's amazing. So never ever forget how much power you have to sort of create something, and don't forget that is you're building your reputation every single day. So be thinking about it that way. As much as you can be bitter about, oh, why did I get this story? Or, oh, why am I here today because somebody called out and it's a Saturday, yeah, okay, that's true. It's very annoying. It's very, very common. But also think, okay, but how can I make this my own? How can I make this something that will build my reputation that I own, I carry with me, no matter where I go?
Jared asked a question of one of our guests, and I believe it might have been the first or second session we had, and I've borrowed it with his permission for almost every guest we've had. So I'll ask you that question. If you could roll back the clock and you could look Mark in the eye when he was heading out to Colorado or on his way to Savannah, what would be the one or two things that you just would make sure you told him as he was starting this journey in our industry?
Well, other than go see a psychiatrist right now, because you'll feel better. I would say, don't be so go for it. Go for it. If I was always like, I got sometimes too comfortable. I got comfortable. I got in a good groove, and I just sort of rode. And I'm like, I look back, and I'm like, today, I'm like, hey, I'm glad I met Gene in Birmingham, but did I need to be in Birmingham 5 years? Probably not. I could have moved earlier than that. But again, I'm one of those, I wouldn't change anything people. So, but if I were advising you guys, I would say, yeah, if you're happy, you could still look, you could still be looking. You never know what somebody might offer you, and then you're off to the races.
That's great. Well, we're past the half-hour mark here, so I want to be respectful of your time. Anybody in the cohort, any of our interns have any final questions for Mark before we let him go? See any hands raised?
Oh, you guys are great. I really appreciate the conversation.
Any other final thoughts before we let you go, Mark?
No, listen to Gene. Gene's a smart guy. He knows a lot.
It's been
in all
wonderful.
seriousness.
I appreciate that, sir. Mark, I miss you, brother.
You too. Let's stay in touch.
Let's please do that. Let's please reconnect and,
All right, man.
and chat and keep up. And I really appreciate you sharing your journey with us today. And
You
be
got it.
blessed. We'll talk soon. Okay.
All right. Bye,
now.
guys.